He died standing at attention. Blood poured from the open wound on his side, breath rattling in his chest. Yet still he stood saluting the casket of the man he once called brother. No one commanded him to do it. No human voice ordered him to rise. Alone, broken, dying, he chose. In the heart of the chaos gunshots, and he wasn't even a man. Beneath the tattered folds of ceremony and tradition, hidden among those who had once worn the same uniform but had sold their souls, he stood. 4 legs rooted into blood-stained marble, ears pinned back against the echoes of gunfire, eyes never wavering from the flag-draped coffin. When the traitors fled and the world crumbled, he remained the final sentinel in a war no one wanted to admit had reached home. This is not the story you think you know, and he is not the soldier history ever thought to remember. Stay with us as we reveal the truth they tried to bury. If this moment already shook you like this video, subscribe for the full story and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and at what point did you realize who the real hero was? The morning air clung heavily to the chapel, thick with the scent of lilies and polished oak. Rays of pale sunlight strained through the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows on the floor, like silent echoes of the life that had been lost. Rows of soldiers stood rigidly on either side of the aisle, uniforms pressed to perfection, faces locked in grim masks of discipline. The world outside seemed to have stopped breathing. Only the slow, deliberate steps of the honor guard broke the stillness, their boots a steady drumbeat of ritual against the marble floor. At the center of it all lay the dark oak casket, draped impeccably with the folded flag. No one spoke, no one dared. Grief hung too thickly in the air, heavy as lead, fragile as glass. In the far back corner of the room, nearly swallowed by the crowd, a German shepherd sat. His coat was thick, black and tan, polished to a dignified sheen, but his eyes burned with something deeper than sorrow. Orion, the loyal companion, the silent witness to 100 missions no one would ever speak of, sat trembling at the leash of a young officer assigned to handle him for the day. The leash twitched once, twice. Then Orion pulled. It was not a frantic tug, not the desperate lunge of an animal in distress. No, it was calculated, determined, purposeful. The young officer tried to resist, but Orion's weight, his sure force of will, dragged the boy forward. Step after deliberate step. A soft gasp rippled through the pews as the dog broke through the formation, heading directly toward the casket. Nobody stopped him. Nobody could. The room, already steeped in silence, plunged even deeper into a vacuum of breathless disbelief. Orion reached the foot of the casket and halted. Then, with a precision no one had taught him for today, he straightened his back, lifted his head high, and assumed the perfect military salute, standing at rigid attention. Just as the soldiers lining the aisle, murmurs broke out like ripples across a still pond. Some hands shot to mouths. Others clutched crumpled tissues harder against trembling lips. A woman near the front began to sob openly, the sound a raw gash through the fragile dignity of the ceremony. Up by the pulpit, Colonel Warren Fields, retired, stood frozen behind the podium, his prepared speech wilting in his shaking hands. He had seen battlefield valor. He had buried men before, but this was something else. His throat convulsed once, twice, and then the old warrior known for never shedding a tear, even under mortar fire, choked on a sob that shattered what little composure he had left. He wasn't just a companion, Fields rasped into the microphone, his voice breaking. This dog bored Orion. Orion was part of an elite canine unit attached to Special Forces. Missions so classified not even the Pentagon listed them. He and Major Carter weren't just partners, they were brothers. A stunned silence blanketed the room once again, thick and suffocating. Soldiers who had fought battles hardened their jaws, blinking hard. Family members clutched each other a little tighter, as if to shield themselves from the overwhelming tide of revelation. Orion didn't flinch. His body remained taut, muscles locked in a salute that could have been carved from stone. Only the slow, steady heaving of his chest betrayed that he was still alive, still fighting his own unseen battle against grief. Colonel Fields lowered his head. Gathering himself, he never forgot, the old man whispered almost to himself. Even without the uniform, even after the missions were done, loyalty like that, it never fades. For a long moment, no one moved. The honor guard, poised to fire the final salute outside, hesitated, unsure whether to proceed, unwilling to break the sacred moment. Even the youngest children in the pews seemed to sense that something monumental was happening, something their minds might not yet comprehend, but their hearts would remember forever. Then Orion, as if sensing it was time, lowered his head solemnly, his tail still, his eyes never leaving the coffin draped in colors he had once fought for without question. Somewhere a bell tolled a single low, resonant note that rolled through the chapel like thunder underwater. The day had not truly begun yet, and already it had changed everyone who bore witness to this impossible act of love, duty, and mourning. In that stillness, amid fractured light and muted weeping, one thing became piercingly clear. This was not just a funeral, this was a battlefield in its own right, a final stand of loyalty. And Orion, the soldier forgotten by records but not by memory, had made his last report. He had come to stand beside his fallen brother one last time, and he would not leave until duty was fulfilled. The chapel held its breath, every soul inside pinned to the impossible sight before them, as if the walls themselves had leaned in closer to listen. Colonel Fields gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles white, his breathing ragged, the weight of old memories dragging him under. "There's something you all need to know," he said, voice gravelly from years of command and too many unshed tears. He lifted his eyes to the congregation, and for a moment even the stained glass seemed to dim, as if the past he was about to unearth would darken even the purest light. Orion was more than a K-9 unit. He was part of Operation Silent Echo. A low murmur spread through the room, veterans stiffening at the name, civilians glancing nervously around. Silent Echo was a ghost story among soldiers, a mission so blackened from the official record that not even FOIA requests could pry it loose. It was a whisper traded in dimly lit bars between men who bore scars nobody dared to ask about. Field's voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. 4 years ago, halfway across the world, Major Carter led a unit into the Korak Highlands. Their mission was to extract a double agent who had the codes to end a regional conflict before it started. Only 4 men made it into that valley. None were expected to return. Fields paused, letting the weight of it settle. Only 2 made it out alive, and Orion. The words slammed into the crowd like a mortar blast. Eyes widened, heads shook in disbelief. No medals had been awarded, no names had been spoken. They had been told the mission was a training accident, a tragedy buried under layers of bureaucracy and lies. Fields wiped a trembling hand across his face. When the ambush came, it was brutal, merciless. Radio signals jammed, air support turned back by storm systems that didn't exist on any forecast. They were trapped. And when Carter took a sniper's bullet to the leg and went down, he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It was Orion who dragged him 3 miles across enemy lines. 3 miles, under fire, bleeding, exposed. He turned toward the casket then, his voice cracking with a reverence deeper than words. Carter owed his life to him. Every breath Carter took after that day was because this animal refused to leave him behind. Another gasp escaped the rows of mourners. A woman clutched the arm of her husband. A young soldier dropped his gaze to his boots, shame burning his ears, realizing he had once joked about the uselessness of military dogs. Orion remained at attention, unmoved, his vigil unbroken, his very existence a living testament to loyalty forged under fire. Colonel Fields stepped away from the podium then, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight he had carried for years. He moved slowly toward the casket, stopping just short of it, his eyes locked not on Carter's flag-draped body, but on the steadfast figure of Orion. His voice softened, no longer speaking to the crowd but to the memory of a fallen brother. "Major Carter once told me something after they got back, something no report ever captured. He said, 'If I fall before that dog does, I want him to be honored not as a pet, not as an asset, but as a soldier. Full rights, full respect, full salute.'" Fields smiled brokenly. "He made me promise. And now, God help me, I intend to keep it." A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the room, the fragile spell of grief twisting tighter into something sharper, something sacred. Soldiers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, their discipline cracking under the unfiltered pressure of raw, unfiltered emotion. Even the air felt charged, alive with the weight of vows made and the unrelenting duty to see them fulfilled. Fields took another slow step forward, pulling a small velvet box from inside his blazer. The simple, worn fabric seemed almost too humble for what it contained. With a trembling hand, he opened it, revealing a miniature brass insignia, the military rank of Staff Sergeant. The small bar gleamed under the fractured light like a fallen star. The chapel doors creaked softly on their hinges as a late gust of wind slithered through the heavy space. Dust motes danced in the beams of sun, floating like spirits freed from their earthly anchors. Fields knelt slowly in front of Orion, the old man's knees popping audibly, the act itself a profound surrender. He held the box out with both hands, a silent offering. "For your service, for your loyalty, for your brotherhood," Fields whispered. Barely audible but somehow echoing in every heart present. Orion's eyes flickered, a brief, ghost-like tremor of recognition passing through the stalwart facade. He lowered his head solemnly, as if bowing not just to the man kneeling before him, but to the memories stitched into every scar, every breath, every heartbeat that had brought him to this moment. Fields clipped the insignia gently to Orion's collar, his hands steady now, the ceremony as deliberate as any battlefield commission. For a heartbeat, for a breathless second in time, the chapel stood suspended between worlds. The past screaming from the blood-soaked valleys of Korik, the present kneeling in silent homage, and the future trembling on the cusp of revelation. And yet, even as the heavy silence wrapped itself tighter around them, something else stirred at the edge of consciousness. Something Orion sensed before any human could. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared, his muscles coiled imperceptibly at first. The shift was so subtle only a few closest to him even noticed, but the undercurrent it carried promised that the story unfolding here today was far from over. The silence that had draped itself over the chapel like a shroud now grew taut, vibrating with invisible tension as the honor guard moved into formation outside. Through the arched doorway, the gleam of ceremonial rifles caught the fractured sunlight, their barrels polished to mirror-like perfection. Inside, mourners rose to their feet in somber unison, the pews creaking under the collective weight of reverence. Colonel Fields remained kneeling before Orion, his fingers lingering just for a second longer on the insignia he had affixed to the dog's collar. Then he rose slowly, shoulders squared once again by the ancient call of duty. A distant voice barked orders outside, crisp and clear against the still morning air. "Ready!" A synchronized click of bolts sliding into place echoed like thunder across the ground. He boomed. The rifles lifted in unison, the soldiers' movements machine-like, bodies stiff with the discipline of hundreds of hours drilled into their bones. But before the final command could pierce the air, something unexpected, something primal, tore through the fabric of ritual. Orion, who until now had stood a perfect statue of loyalty, suddenly tilted his head back and released a sound so raw, so piercingly strange, that every head snapped toward him at once. It was not a howl of grief, nor the instinctual whine of a dog sensing death. It was something calculated, deliberate, almost mechanical, a low, keening wail threaded with subtle tonal shifts, like the encrypted frequencies of a forgotten battlefield. Colonel Fields staggered back a step, his face blanching as realization dawned. He had heard that sound before, once, deep in the blackened valleys of Korak, when Carter had used Orion's training to trigger a fallback protocol, a hidden distress signal embedded into the dog's very muscle memory. A signal known only to them, a signal that meant one thing: immediate danger. "Fire!" barked the sergeant outside, and the synchronized crack of rifles exploded in the air, 3 volleys fired skyward as tradition dictated. At first, it seemed nothing had gone wrong, the sharp scent of gunpowder lingering like a ghost of ancient battles. Then, on the second volley, one rifle jammed audibly, its firing mechanism grinding in protest. The soldier holding it stumbled, his formation broken, panic flashing across his face as his weapon clattered to the ground. The ceremony fractured, officers rushing toward him in a scramble of boots and shouted commands. As the rifle hit the ground, the cartridge chamber cracked open, and a single brass casing tumbled out, bouncing once against the marble before rolling in a lazy circle near Orion's paws. But it wasn't a normal casing. It gleamed wrongly, oddly heavy, and from its broken seams something small and metallic slipped out and skidded across the floor. A collective gasp rose from the witnesses closest to the scene. Colonel Fields lunged forward instinctively, snatching the object up before it could vanish among the shuffling boots of the crowd. It was no bullet. It was a tiny flash drive, encased in a hollowed-out shell. Fields's heart hammered against his ribs like a war drum. Around him, chaos rippled through the ranks. The commanding officers barked orders to secure the perimeter. Some tried to calm the growing panic among the civilians, but it was like trying to stop a flood with bare hands. Orion remained motionless, his amber eyes locked not on Fields nor the fallen weapon, but on something or someone deeper within the crowd. His body tense, his hackles rising like storm clouds rolling in over a blackened sea. Fields turned the flash drive over in his hand, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He recognized the insignia etched faintly into the metal. An eagle clutching lightning bolts, the symbol of military intelligence, Special Activities Division. No one should have had access to this. No one, especially not hidden inside a ceremonial rifle at a funeral. His mind raced, connecting fractured images together. Orion's coded howl, the flash drive disguised within a casing, the jammed weapon, the heavy gaze that even now seemed to press down from somewhere in the crowd. This was no accident. This was a breach that screamed of betrayal. He felt Orion's body tense beside him, the dog's muscles like stretched wires ready to snap. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Orion shifted his stance, angling his body between Fields and the assembled mourners. Protection mode. Fields gritted his teeth, his training snapping into place. He tucked the flash drive into the inner pocket of his blazer with the smooth efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime burying secrets before they could get him killed. Raising his head, he scanned the crowd, searching for eyes that moved wrong, too quickly, too calculatingly. Somewhere in this chapel, someone had orchestrated this breach, and whatever information Carter had died protecting was still at risk. A subtle vibration buzzed against Fields's chest. He fished into his pocket and retrieved his government-issued secure phone. A single line of text blinked on the cracked screen. "You are not safe, trust no one." His mouth went dry. Around him, mourners murmured nervously, their eyes darting from soldier to soldier, from rifle to rifle, unsure whether they were witnessing an accident, a threat, or something worse. But Orion knew. His rigid stance, the slow sweep of his gaze, the low rumble in his throat that never quite rose to a full growl. They were all signs Fields had learned to read a lifetime ago, signs that said one thing: the enemy was already inside. The weight of the flash drive against Colonel Fields's chest burned hotter with every second. But before he could act, before he could slip away into a corner and find out what hell Carter had left behind, another disturbance rippled through the chapel. Orion, who had held himself like a soldier at attention mere minutes before, suddenly lunged toward the casket, his claws clattering sharply against the polished marble floor. The leash slipped from Fields' fingers before he could react, and the German shepherd threw himself bodily against the side of the casket with a low, desperate whine that quickly escalated into frantic scratching. The noise shattered the fragile, stunned silence that had settled over the mourners, drawing every eye back toward the front of the room, where honor and grief were quickly giving way to confusion and growing fear. "Control the dog," a voice barked sharply from the back of the chapel, but no one moved to obey. Soldiers shifted uncertainly. Civilians murmured. Field stood frozen, instincts warring inside him, knowing that Orion's behavior was no random fit of grief. The dog, trained to perfection in detecting danger, uncovering threats, had smelled something wrong. "Somebody stop him," another voice cried, high-pitched, panicked, but again no one moved. Orion's claws scraped fiercely against the wood, his paws leaving faint scratches on the rich, dark finish as he threw his weight against the casket lid. His growls deepening, resonating with a note of warning so clear that even those without military training could feel it shudder through their bones. Margaret Carter, the major's elder sister, pale and trembling, clutched her husband's arm and whispered, "Open it, please, open it." The funeral director hesitated, horror etched into every line of his face. But Margaret's voice rose, brittle but unwavering. "Open the casket now?" Fields snapped into motion, crossing the floor in 3 long strides. He signaled sharply to the 2 junior officers standing at the ready nearby, and without a word they moved to the casket, hands trembling slightly as they undid the ornate clasps with fumbling fingers. The lid creaked as it lifted, the sound raw and wrong in the silent chapel, like the opening of a tomb rather than a tribute. Orion immediately reared up, front paws landing heavily on the lip of the coffin, his muzzle thrust inside, sniffing with sharp, urgent jerks. For a heartbeat, the crowd caught only a glimpse of Major Carter's face, serene in death, the crisp folds of his uniform meticulously arranged over his still body, the metals gleaming dimly against the deep blue fabric. But then Orion shifted, pawing insistently at Carter's chest, nudging the immaculate jacket aside with surprising delicacy for a creature so powerful. Fields leaned closer, heart hammering wildly against his ribs, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There, tucked just beneath the lapel of Carter's dress blues, almost invisible against the stark white of the burial shroud, was a thin envelope, sealed with old ashen wax. No official military stamp, no government insignia, just a heavy red seal, cracked slightly from the dog's persistent pawing. Fields reached out with a hand that felt far too large and clumsy, peeling back the jacket just enough to retrieve the envelope. The texture of the paper was rough against his fingertips, handmade, heavy, the kind of material used to carry secrets across battlefields and centuries alike. He turned it over once, twice, seeing no address, no marking other than the crude wax seal bearing a single simple insignia, a broken sword. Recognition hit him like a punch to the gut, the insignia of Black Sigma, a unit so covert that even whispers of it were rare, and those who spoke too freely often disappeared. His mouth went dry. The flash drive was dangerous enough. This was dynamite wrapped in silk. He looked down at Carter's body, his old friend's face composed and peaceful, and realized with a sinking heart that the Major had known exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a random accident. Carter had hidden the letter on his own body, trusting that only Orion would know how to reveal it, trusting that only Fields or someone who remembered the old codes would understand its importance. Orion let out a soft whine, low and insistent, his nose bumping gently against Fields' hand, as if urging him to move, to act before it was too late. Fields slipped the envelope inside his coat with the same smooth, efficient movement he had used to conceal the flash drive, feeling the combined weight of the 2 artifacts like iron shackles against his ribs. He straightened slowly, aware of the dozens of eyes boring into him. Some curious, Margaret's gaze caught his sharp and questioning, but she said nothing, only tightened her grip on her husband's arm. Somewhere near the back of the chapel, a figure moved a shadow where no shadow should have been, a ripple against the polished wood and stained glass. Fields' instincts screamed at him, but he forced himself to remain composed, to nod solemnly to the funeral director, signaling him to close the casket once more. The lid fell shut with a finality that echoed down to the marrow of every bone in the room. Orion sat back on his haunches, his duty fulfilled for the moment, but his body remained tense, his ears pricked forward, his eyes never straying from that distant shadow. Fields turned back toward the altar, his mind racing faster than his body could follow. The flash drive, the letter, the broken sword seal, Black Sigma, somewhere amid the mourning, amid the empty words and hollow salutes. A battle far older and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine was awakening. And if Fields didn't act soon, if he didn't decipher the next move before the enemy struck, they would all be swallowed by it. Fields moved like a man burdened by invisible chains, every step from the casket heavier than the last, the weight of the hidden envelope pressing like a brand against his chest. He slipped between pews and mourners, nodding to no one, his mind already spiraling into darker territories, toward memories he had buried deep in the hopes they would never surface again. Orion padded silently beside him, his movements slow, deliberate, each paw step a whisper against the polished marble. His body still coiled tight with anticipation, as if sensing the next blow before it fell. Fields found a shadowed alcove near the rear of the chapel, shielded from direct view by heavy velvet drapes and centuries-old stone. With trouble wax seal with a careful thumb, and unfolded the rough, fibrous paper inside. The handwriting struck him first, neat, military in precision, but carrying an unmistakable urgency. The letters gouged harder into the page as if Carter had been racing against time, perhaps even against death itself. Fields forced his breathing to slow and read. "If you're holding this," the letter began, "then it means the contingency has failed. It means they got to me." His gut clenched. His eyes flicked to the chapel beyond the drapes, to the solemn crowd still gathered, unaware of the battle raging under the surface of this ceremony. He returned to the letter. "Your death will be ruled an accident, a complication. Maybe a health crisis, maybe a stray bullet no one saw. Don't believe it. I was killed, and the one who did it," Fields swallowed hard, bracing himself, "is someone we once called brother." The words clawed at him, ripping open old wounds that had never truly healed. He read on, the world narrowing to the crackling paper in his hands. "You remember Operation Echo. You remember the 4 of us. Only 3 made it home, or so we thought. One of us never really left the highlands. One of us changed, shot through the neck during the extraction." Hayes had come back broken but alive. He had sat beside Fields at the funeral. They had mourned Carter's wounds, mourned Ramirez's death, mourned the cost. But if Carter's words were true, if Hayes had not been the same man who had left the highlands, then the betrayal ran deeper than any scar Fields bore. The letter continued, relentless. "Hayes made a deal. We never knew with who. Silent Echo wasn't just a mission, it was a test. Black Sigma suspected a mole. They used us as bait. And it worked." Fields gritted his teeth, fury and grief roiling inside him, a volatile mixture he barely kept contained. "Hayes is the key. He has the drive, he has the codes. My death was the final insurance. With me gone, there's no voice left to call him out." Except Fields felt his blood run cold as his eyes reached the final lines. "Except Orion." The letter shifted tone, more clinical, more precise. Orion was conditioned, back during advanced canine training, for deep mission protocols. Special trigger. He can identify threats through specific verbal cues embedded over months of bonding. A name, a sound. If he hears it, he reacts. He knows. Fields' breath caught in his throat. Orion was not just mourning, Orion was a witness. A living, breathing safeguard Carter had left behind when no other protection could be trusted. Fields glanced down at the dog beside him, seeing now with new eyes the stillness, the hyper-awareness, the deliberate way Orion's body positioned itself toward the crowd, always between Fields and potential danger. "If anything happens," the letter concluded, "you must let him finish what we started. Trust him. Trust no one else, not even the uniforms you think you know. No signature, no further instructions, just the brutal finality of truth laid bare." Fields folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into his coat alongside the flash drive. His mind spun with possibilities, with plans forming and collapsing in rapid succession. If Hayes was here today, and God help them if he was, it meant the danger was not just to Fields. It meant everyone in the chapel was at risk. Orion shifted beside him again, a low growl building deep in his throat, not loud enough to draw attention but unmistakable to Fields, who had learned long ago to trust instincts born on bloodied sand and frozen hills. Somewhere in that room, Hayes was watching, waiting, ready to clean up the last loose ends if necessary. Fields pressed a comic hand to Orion's neck, feeling the taut vibration of tension under fur. The dog's gaze locked onto a cluster of mourners near the front. A group of officers and old friends gathered in a solemn knot. Fields strained to see, heart pounding, vision narrowing until he caught a glimpse of a face too composed, too detached, the eyes cold and scanning even in mourning. Hayes. It had to be. But he needed confirmation. He needed proof that would stand against the lies sure to come. And he needed to trigger the failsafe Carter had hidden inside Orion. Slowly, silently, Fields crouched beside the dog, murmuring low under his breath. "Find him, boy," he said, via Cessna splash light. Hayes's. The effect was immediate. Orion's entire body stiffened, his head snapping toward the officers with a sharpness that made slightly more. His hackles rose, ears pinning back, lips curling in a silent snarl. No bark, no charge, just pure, focused identification. Orion had found his target. Fields rose slowly, his mind racing, the next steps already crystallizing into necessity. The enemy was among them, wrapped in uniform and lies, and time was running out. Fields straightened slowly from his crouch, heart hammering against his ribs, the low rumble in Orion's chest vibrating up through his hand like the distant tremor of an approaching storm. Hayes was here, disguised among mourners cloaked in sorrow and honor, his face a careful mask, his body relaxed to the casual observer but too still, too rehearsed to fool anyone trained to see past the surface. Fields had no doubt now, but knowledge alone would not save them, not in a room where any wrong move could turn ceremony into slaughter. He scanned the crowd quickly, measuring distances, exits, allies, and unknowns. He needed to act, but he needed to act smart. Orion's body remained taut, a loaded spring awaiting only Fields' command, but before he could give it, a shadow detached itself from the periphery of the gathered officers and began to move toward them. Captain Emerson, retired Special Forces, one of the old guard, a man Fields had once trusted with his life, approached with slow, measured steps, a tight smile on his lips that did not reach his eyes. "Colonel Fields," Emerson said, voice low, oiled with false warmth. "Might I have a word?" Fields stiffened but nodded cautiously, schooling his features into polite neutrality. Emerson gestured vaguely toward the rear hallway, a place where echoes swallowed conversation and watchful eyes could be avoided. Fields hesitated, then made a subtle hand signal Orion would recognize from countless past operations. "Stay." The dog obeyed, sitting rigidly, muscles still humming with readiness. The Chappas narrows his eyes nudged past. Fields followed Emerson into the hallway, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind them with a dull, final thud. Emerson wasted no time. "You found something, didn't you?" he asked, voice stripped of pretense now, the easy facade crumbling to reveal the soldier beneath. Fields said nothing, his silence more dangerous than any denial. Emerson's mouth twisted into a grimace. "Look, Carter was my friend too," he said, lowering his voice further. "You don't understand what you're getting into. There are things bigger than one man's death. Bigger than a funeral." Fields narrowed his eyes, feeling the old instincts sharpen inside him like a blade drawn silently from its sheath. "You're not here to warn me," he said quietly. "You're here to make sure I don't act." Emerson's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something regret passed through his eyes. "It's not just you, they'll bury you if you push this," he said. "It's everyone in this room. The truth you're digging for, it's a tomb, not a rescue mission." Fields clenched his fists at his sides. "Carter deserves better," he said. Emerson's eyes hardened. Deserve has nothing to do with survival. Without waiting for a response, Emerson turned on his heel and strode back toward the main chapel, his shoulders rigid, his steps almost too deliberate. Fields followed at a distance, mind racing, the unspoken threat hanging between them heavier than any words could capture. As he stepped back into the main hall, he saw Emerson pause beside Orion, reaching casually, almost lazily, for the dog's collar, as if to leash him, to lead him away under the pretense of control. But the second Emerson's fingers brushed Orion's neck, something incredible happened. Orion reacted not with a growl or a snap, but with a sudden, precise movement, planting his feet firmly and emitting a low, specific sound, a sequence of 3 short, clipped barks, followed by a sharp, guttural whine. To the unentrained ear, it sounded like agitation. To Fields, it was a code, a signal from the old days, identification protocol. Orion had been trained in a final line of defense, a last resort measure for identifying threats when words and trust. And now, in the heart of this solemn ceremony, surrounded by uniforms and memories and betrayals, the dog had chosen to activate it. Fields froze, understanding in a rush what it meant. Orion wasn't reacting to Emerson's touch alone. He was signaling the presence of a known traitor, marking him the only way he could without violence. The 3 barks: alert, identification, confirmation. The whine compromised the ally. Emerson's hand jerked back as if burned, his face paling, but it was too late. Orion's message had been delivered. Fields felt the eyes of others turning subtly, registering the disturbance, sensing the shift in atmosphere without fully understanding it. He moved quickly, intercepting Orion before the situation could spiral, his voice low but firm. "Heel." Orion obeyed instantly, falling into step beside him, but his body remained rigid, his gaze locked once more onto Hayes, who now seemed to sense that the tide had shifted in some way he could not yet fully read. Emerson hesitated only a moment longer before stepping back into the ranks of mourners, his movements suddenly too stiff, too rehearsed. Fields knew then that Emerson was not alone in his loyalties. Whatever web had ensnared Carter, whatever shadow operation had rewritten the truth of Silent Echo, it was alive and breathing among them even now. Fields slid a hand into his jacket, feeling the flash drive press against his ribs, the letter crinkling slightly beneath his fingers. Proof, maybe enough, maybe not. Either way, the window for subtlety was closing fast. He needed allies. He needed a plan. And most of all, he needed to protect Orion at all costs. For the dog was no longer just a companion or a relic of a forgotten war. He was the last living piece of the truth Carter had died to preserve. And judging by the tightening knot of tension rippling through the chapel, the enemy knew it too. Fields barely had time to register Orion's coded alert before movement on the far side of the chapel caught his attention. Haze shifted, subtle but unmistakable, slipping between mourners under the pretense of offering condolences. His body language careful but betraying an edge of urgency that Fields and any trained observer could spot a mile away. Fields cursed under his breath and moved, keeping Orion tight at his side, weaving through the stunned mourners with a grace born of necessity. He knew Haze wouldn't wait, wouldn't risk staying any longer now that he suspected the net was closing around him. And sure enough, as Fields cleared the last pew, he saw Haze make his break, slipping through a side door leading out to the funeral home's broad ceremonial courtyard, where the honor guard was still loosely assembled after the rifle salute. Fields didn't shout. Shouting would cause panic, would turn the entire crowd into chaos. Instead, he quickened his pace, tapping out a short code on his secure communicator, signaling the nearest loyal officers to be ready without tipping their hand. The courtyard was a vast stretch of flagstone bordered by manicured hedges and marble statues, the American flag fluttering heavily above them under a sky that seemed suddenly far too wide, far too exposed. Haze moved fast, his purposeful but not panicked, heading toward a service gate near the outer wall, the quickest way to disappear into the city beyond. But he wasn't alone. The honor guard, still standing in partial formation, noticed the disturbance immediately. These were no mere ceremonial soldiers. Many of them were active duty or recently retired special ops, and training took over where decorum failed. They shifted, moving subtly, corralling Haze without appearing aggressive, cutting off his angles of escape even as he tried to slip unnoticed through the solemn ranks. Haze realized too late that he had trapped himself. Fields could almost see the calculation behind the man's eyes, the desperate weighing of options as he slowed, feigning a stumble, one hand dipping toward his waist where Fields knew a weapon was likely hidden beneath the funeral-issue jacket. Orion tensed beside him, a low growl vibrating in his chest, his entire body quivering with the need to act. Fields raised a hand slightly, signaling restraint, buying another few seconds to let the noose tighten. Then it happened. One of the honor guards, a Sergeant Fields didn't recognize immediately, broke formation. Stepping casually too fast, Fields' instincts screamed a warning even before he saw the glint of metal in the sergeant's hand, the flash of a concealed sidearm being drawn under the cover of his ceremonial jacket. The sergeant was not there to arrest Haze. He was there to extract him, or to kill him if necessary. Haze and the sergeant locked eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that silent exchange Fields saw the truth confirmed. The rot went deeper than one man. Fields acted without thinking. He barked a sharp command, and Orion launched forward like a missile, muscles uncoiling with explosive force, teeth bared not at Haze but at the rogue sergeant. The man stumbled back, firing a wild shot that cracked the air like a whip, sending mourners diving for cover, their screams shredding the brittle calm that had barely held them together. Chaos erupted in an instant. Fields drew his own weapon, moving to intercept Haze, but the man was already pivoting, sprinting for the gate, the rogue sergeant forgotten in the sudden scramble for survival. Other honor guards moved too, those still loyal forming a loose perimeter, trying to contain the madness without worsening. Orion took the sergeant down with brutal efficiency, jaws clamping onto the man's gun arm, dragging him to the ground with a force that made the weapon skitter harmlessly across the flagstone. Fields vaulted a low hedge, cutting Haze off from the gate, shouting orders now, no longer caring who heard. Secure the perimeter, no one in or out. Hayes veered left, trying to find another exit, but two uniformed officers moved to block him, their weapons drawn. Their faces hesitated for a heartbeat too long. Fields saw the decision flicker across his face: surrender or fight, and knew immediately which path the traitor would choose. Hayes reached for his belt, yanking something small and metallic free. Fields caught the briefest glimpse: a detonation switch, thumb hovering over the trigger. Down, Fields bellowed, diving forward, tackling Hayes bodily to the ground as the man's thumb pressed instinctively, desperately, against the useless switch. The device fizzled, a dud. By sabotage, Fields didn't care, only that the explosion never came. They struggled on the ground, fists and knees and boots in a brutal, graceless tangle, until Orion barreled into them both, knocking Fields clear with the gentlest push of his massive shoulder. Before pinning Hayes beneath his heavy paws, teeth bared an inch from the man's throat. Hayes froze, terror plain on his face, blood trickling from a split lip, a soldier's mask shattered into the raw, ugly truth beneath. Around them, the courtyard stabilized slowly, officers moving to secure the rogue sergeant, civilians being shepherded to safety inside the building. The funeral now nothing more than a memory smothered beneath sirens and shouted commands. Fields pushed himself to his feet, wincing, feeling every one of his years in the protest of his joints, and stood over Hayes, breathing hard. "It's over," he said. Breathing. Hayes laughed, a short, bitter sound, the laugh of a man who knew that even in defeat, he had bought time for darker forces to move. "You think this ends with me?" he rasped, eyes gleaming with something that was not fear but triumph, pointed it into hatred. "You don't even know what you're standing on." Fields met his gaze without blinking, a soldier to the end. "Then it's time we start digging." Fields tightened his grip on Hayes's collar, ready to haul him to his feet and finish this grim chapter. But in that fraction of a heartbeat when victory seemed within reach, another gunshot cracked the air, sharp and close and wrong. Instinct screamed through Fields's veins. But even before he could react, he saw it: the second traitor, another rogue officer hiding among the loyal honor guard, stepping from the shadows near the chapel's northern wall, weapon drawn, sight locked not on Fields or Hayes but on a smaller figure just beyond the turmoil. Margaret Carter's son, Thomas, barely 17, dressed in his ill-fitting suit, had slipped through the crowd in his desperation to reach the casket, to be near the father he had lost, unaware that he had wandered straight into the crosshairs. Fields moved without thinking, shoving Hayes to the ground as he reached for his sidearm, but it was too far, too slow, and he knew it even as he lunged. The world slowed to a cruel crawl, sounds stretching into a... The muzzle flash burst like a miniature sun from the traitor's weapon, the bullets slicing through the courtyard, an executioner's hand reaching for the boy who had already lost too much. But then Orion moved, with a power born not of muscle alone but of purpose, of devotion honed sharper than any blade. Orion launched himself across the flagstones, a streak of fur and fury, intercepting the bullet's path with his own body. The impact was sickening, a thud that seemed to shake the earth beneath them, followed by a sharp yelp that tore through the noise like a blade through silk. Time snapped back into brutal motion. Fields fired without hesitation, his bullet finding the rogue officer's chest with the precision of 30 years' training, dropping him instantly. Around him, loyal soldiers surged forward, securing the scene, disarming survivors, dragging wounded and traitors alike into custody. But Fields' world had narrowed to a single point. A single figure sprawled on the stone, his black and tan fur matted with blood that spread dark and thick against the pale ground. Orion lay on his side, chest heaving shallowly, eyes blinking slow and heavy with pain. Yet even as Fields dropped to his knees beside him, even as Margaret screamed, and Thomas collapsed sobbing beside the shattered casket, Orion stirred. With a strength that defied reason, defied biology, defied every law of nature except the law of loyalty, Orion struggled upright, pushing against the pull of death with a determination that broke Fields' heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the traitors or the soldiers or even Fields. No, Orion turned, slowly, deliberately, his wounded body shaking with the effort, until he faced the casket draped in the colors he had fought beside, lived beside, bled beside, and then, in a motion so achingly familiar, so impossibly perfect. He stood, his paws planted squarely, his back straight, his head high, the salute of a soldier rendered in flesh and blood and iron will, as the life drained from his body. Fields felt the tears sting his eyes, hot and unwanted, but he made no move to stop them. Around him, silence fell once more, not the silence of fear or confusion, but the reverent, sacred silence of a battlefield at dusk, when the living and the dead part ways, each honoring the other. Orion's legs buckled, but he did not fall. Not yet. His gaze remained fixed on the casket, on the memory of his fallen handler, the bond that not even death could. His breathing slowed, each gasp a ragged whisper, each second a war fought and won against the darkness closing in. Fields reached out, his hand hovering just above Orion's back, unwilling to disturb that final moment of defiance, of loyalty made manifest. Margaret knelt beside her son, her face a ruin of grief and awe, her hands pressed over Tomas's shaking. Somewhere in the distance, the flag on the chapel roof snapped sharply in the rising wind. A salute rendered in cloth and sky. Orion's body swayed once more, then froze, locked in that perfect stance, his eyes bright even as the light within them dimmed. He did not fall. He simply stopped. A stillness deeper than silence settled over him, over the courtyard, over every soul who had seen and understood what had just been given, what had been protected. Fields bowed his head, a gesture of respect, of mourning, of gratitude too vast for words. Around him, others did the same, a spontaneous, uncoordinated wave of honor rolling outward from the epicenter of sacrifice. No orders were given, none were needed. Every man, every woman, every heart that had beaten within those grounds knew what had been witnessed. Orion had stood his last watch. He had fulfilled his final duty, and though his body would not rise again, his spirit stood sentinel still, unwavering, unbreakable, watching over them all. The courtyard remained suspended in that strange, weightless silence, the kind that follows after the last shot has been fired, after the last breath has been taken. Fields knelt beside Orion's still form, the dog's body cooling against the warm stones, a monument to sacrifice more eloquent than any speech could ever hope to be. Around him, the soldiers slowly began to stir. But there was no shouting now, no scrambling confusion. There was only a solemn, deliberate movement, the instinctive respect paid to a fallen warrior. Fields' hand brushed against Orion's collar, a simple gesture of farewell, and that was when he felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible click beneath the insignia he had pinned on the dog only hours before. His fingers explored the badge carefully, finding the hidden seam, the micro-latch no civilian would have ever thought to search for. Beneath the layer of brass and enamel was a tiny device, smaller than his thumbnail, but humming faintly with latent power. A recording device. Carter's last insurance. Heart hammering in his chest, Fields slipped the device free and turned it over in his palm. It was already blinking, a soft green pulse that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. Without thinking, trusting the instinct that had kept him alive through darker days than this, he tapped the side of the badge twice. The blinking sped up, and then the device crackled to life, a tiny speaker spilling sound into the stunned courtyard. "You are hearing this," Carter's voice said, strong and clear despite the tinny distortion. "Then I have fallen." A collective shudder rippled through the gathered soldiers and mourners, their heads turning as one toward the source of the voice. Even those who had doubted, who had whispered behind closed doors about accidents and bad luck, felt the truth in that moment tighten around their throats like a noose. Carter's voice continued, calm and unflinching, the voice of a man who had accepted his fate but refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. "I have been betrayed by those sworn to stand beside me." Silent Echo was never about extraction. It was a purge, a way to isolate and eliminate operatives considered expendable. Hayes orchestrated it, under the direction of a clandestine faction buried deep within our own command structure. Field's stomach twisted as the names began to spill from the device, cold and clinical. A list of officers and agents who had turned their loyalty inward, who had traded honor for ambition, comradeship for power. Emerson's name was there, of course, and others Fields recognized with a hollow pang of disillusionment. Men and women he had fought beside, laughed within rare moments between chaos and fire. The final blow came with Carter's closing words, sharp as a blade. Evidence of the conspiracy, including financial records, Black Ops communication logs, and mission falsification documents, has been encrypted on a secure drive. The password is Orion's designation number, burned into his memory like it was burned into mine. Trust no one outside this circle. Trust Orion. As if summoned by the weight of the words, Fields glanced down at the fallen dog, the simple collar still bearing the faded tag with a string of numbers worn almost to illegibility. He knew them by heart anyway. Every man who had worked with Carter and Orion knew them. A badge number, a silent promise, a thread connecting duty and love and loyalty in ways few would ever understand. Around him, the courtyard erupted into controlled chaos. Loyal officers, civilized by the raw truth pouring from the device, moved swiftly to detain the traitors, weapons drawn not with malice but with grim necessity. Emerson, caught mid-flight toward one of the service gates, was tackled by 2 sergeants and pinned face down on the ground, his shouts of protest falling on ears deafened by revelation. Fields rose slowly, the recording still playing, his voice steady as he barked orders to secure the area, to preserve the evidence, to protect the families and civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of secrets, too heavy for any one man to bear alone. Hayes, bloodied and beaten, glared up at him with a hate so pure it almost burned. But Fields met his gaze with the cold, implacable certainty of a man who knew that truth, once spoken, could never be unmade. "You lost," Fields said simply, pocketing the device with reverence. "Carter won, Orion won." It was not until later, when the courtyard had been swept clean of chaos, when the wounded had been tended, the dead honored, the guilty cuffed and removed under heavy guard, that Fields stood once more before the casket of his fallen friend. Margaret and Thomas stood beside him, silent but unbroken, the weight of sorrow heavy on their shoulders but not crushing them. Thomas reached out hesitantly and touched Orion's collar, his young fingers tracing the numbers engraved there, the last thread connecting him to the father he had lost too soon. Fields placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "He saved you," he said quietly. "He saved all of us." Thomas nodded, tears bright in his eyes but a new fire kindling there too. A seed of understanding, of purpose, planted in blood and watered with sacrifice. Fields turned to the officers who remained, the loyal few, the true brothers in arms who had stood when others had fallen. He lifted the badge device high for all to see. The tone he used with such precision, his words carrying across the courtyard like a banner raised over a battlefield. "Is the truth Carter died to protect, and it will be heard." The weeks that followed the funeral were a blur of investigations, tribunals, classified reports unsealed for the first time in decades, and names once whispered in reverence now spoken with venom. Fields sat through every meeting, every hearing, wearing the truth like armor, even as old wounds reopened and new scars formed. The conspiracy Carter had died to expose unraveled like a rotten tapestry, thread by filthy thread, and as each name fell, so too did the invisible walls of fear and silence that had protected them. But for Fields, for Margaret, for Thomas, and for the soldiers who had witnessed the truth carved into blood and stone that day, there remained one duty left unfulfilled, one honor yet unpaid. It began with a petition, a document drafted not by politicians but by soldiers, signed in quiet offices and dusty barracks, passed hand to hand with the reverence of sacred scripture. Fields led the charge, his name the first on the list, his voice the loudest in the hearings, arguing not with anger but with the cold, undeniable weight of sacrifice. Orion had not simply obeyed orders. He had fought, bled, and died as a soldier, and soldiers deserved to be honored. No exceptions. Resistance came, as it always did, cloaked in tradition and precedent, in whispered doubts and bureaucratic red tape, but the wave of demand was unstoppable. Stories spread, videos surfaced of the final salute, raw footage captured by civilian witnesses whose hands had templed but whose cameras had not wavered. Images of Orion standing in the courtyard, bleeding, dying yet still locked in salute, spread like wildfire, igniting something in the hearts of a nation weary of empty heroics and desperate for real ones. And so it was that on a clear autumn morning, beneath the towering spires of Arlington National Cemetery, the Secretary of Defense stood before a sea of uniforms and civilians. The Medal of Honor gleaming in his gloved hands, Fields stood at the front of the assembly, flanked by Margaret and Thomas, their faces solemn, their backs straight, their eyes bright with unshed tears. The casket bearing Orion's body, polished to a mirror sheen, rested atop a dais draped in crimson and navy, the insignia of his fallen unit emblazoned behind him. The secretary's voice, heavy with emotion and conviction, rang out across the gathered crowd. "Today," he said, "we recognize not merely an animal, but a soldier, a brother in arms, a protector who gave everything he had, not for medals or glory, but for love, for loyalty, and for a cause." He paused, allowing the words to settle, to root themselves in the soil of memory. "By the authority vested in me, and for the first time in our nation's history, I award the Medal of Honor posthumously to Staff Sergeant Orion." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause, a sound that rolled across the cemetery like a living thing, breaking against the headstones and oak trees in waves of gratitude and grief. Margaret wept openly, clutching Thomas to her side, while Fields stood stiffly, blinking rapidly. The image of Orion in his final salute burned forever behind his eyes. The medal was placed carefully atop the casket, a small, almost fragile thing compared to the vastness of the sacrifice it honored. But its weight was undeniable. After the ceremony, the procession moved slowly to the northern edge of the cemetery, where workers had toiled for weeks under secrecy and urgency to complete what would stand long after memory had faded. There, bathed in the soft golden light of late morning, stood the monument, a life-sized bronze sculpture of Orion, captured mid-salute, head high, eyes fierce and unwavering, body tense with the eternal readiness of a soldier forever on watch. At his paws, inscribed in simple, bold lettering, were the words loyalty, duty, sacrifice. Never forgotten. Fields approached the statue first, his footsteps slow, reverent. He reached out and let his hand rest lightly on the cold bronze, feeling the strength and warmth that still seemed to radiate from it, as if the spirit of Orion lingered, standing watch not just over the fallen, but over the living as well. Margaret and Thomas followed, the boy's fingers tracing the contours of the sculpted fur, the proud tilt of the ears, the rigid line of the spine. Around them, soldiers and civilians alike gathered, some saluting, others bowing their heads, all bowed by the silent understanding that true heroism transcends species, transcends circumstance, transcends death itself. Reporters tried to capture it, artists tried to paint it, poets tried to distill it into words, but none could fully encapsulate the raw purity of what Orion represented. In the years that followed, the monument became a pilgrimage site for soldiers young and old, for families who had lost and families who still hoped, for anyone who needed to believe that courage could still walk among them, even if on 4 legs instead of 2. And Fields, now older, his hair more silver than black, found himself there often, sitting quietly at the base of the statue, telling stories only the wind and the trees could hear, stories of loyalty without hesitation, of sacrifice without condition, of a brotherhood forged not by blood but by something stronger. And when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the graves, Fields would rise, place his hand once more on the cold bronze paw, and whisper the same farewell he had given all those years ago in that blood-stained courtyard. "Rest easy, soldier, we've got it from here." And in the heart of Arlington, under an endless sky, Staff Sergeant Orion stood his eternal watch, forever faithful, forever honored, forever home. If this story touched something deep inside you, if Orion's final salute stayed with you long after the last word, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life, stories about courage, loyalty, and the sacrifices that are never forgotten. I would love to hear your thoughts. Which moment from Orion's journey struck you the most, and where are you watching from today? Share it in the comments below. Let's honor these silent heroes together, one story at a time.